conservative, constitutional. It's the Andrew Cooperrider Show, keeping you informed on what's going on right here in Kentucky.
And welcome, everybody, to another amazing day right here on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Today's show will be going over unconstitutional tax cuts. You may be wondering to yourself, how is it possible that it was constitutional to put a tax in place in the first place, but then unconstitutional to remove that tax? Well, that's a bold claim that the Republican leadership made last week. We'll dig into exactly what they're saying, why this is coming up. Balloons, guns, balloon control, gun control. What do they have in common? Well, there's two bills that have been filed by the same sponsor, Representative Banta, that deals with controlling both balloons and guns. We'll dig into those bills and ask ourselves a question of maybe, just maybe, it's not always something you need to make a law about, especially when it comes to balloon control. Maybe you could just let it go. But we're going to have all that and more today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Feel free to reach out. You can email info@theandrewshow.com. Once again, that's info@theandrewshow.com. You can also head over to theandrewshow.com and see all the different places that you can listen to the show. Make sure you've liked, comment, shared, subscribe, all those great things. Without further ado, let's dig into it. But before I go into talking about legislation, because obviously it's legislative session, how else could I be talking about tax cuts, balloons, and guns all in this same episode? Before I dig into it, I have a grind my gears moment, I guess you'd call it, something that's just really bothering me. And it deals with the U.S. Postal Service, the mail. Now, I don't know about you all, where you guys live, but here in Lexington, mail has literally, at least where I'm at in Lexington, mail has not been delivered in like weeks. Ever since the snow came in at first, they are refusing to deliver actual letters, which is, odd considering they would decide to reveal that they're just totally incompetent at their job. I mean, I remember when the Postal Service was called, or slogan was, rain, hail, sleet, snow, we deliver no matter what. But now it's if I can't pull up right next to your mailbox and lean over and put the mail in, I ain't getting out, I ain't walking, I ain't doing anything because I'm too lazy. Which is why I think, we've had this national conversation. Trump says he wants to privatize the U.S. Postal Service, and maybe there's some argument maybe against that. You would say some areas like maybe Alaska or Hawaii or maybe some places more remote that receive mail that places that are a little bit closer are subsidizing. You can make some arguments about that. However, when they refuse to deliver my mail for 2 weeks because they just can't pull up next to mailboxes, I have complaints. And it's not that we haven't tried to get it, okay? Yesterday, my wife stood out there for 30 minutes, an hour, when she heard the post truck was driving around. She stood out there by the mailbox because we hadn't shoveled away the snow. Because what's happened is that the snow plows come through the neighborhoods and then they plow, and then it creates like a berm and a pile up of snow alongside the road. And so the claim by the post office here in Lexington has been, we can't get to your mailbox because of this snow berm. And so my wife stood out there saying, hey, according to our USPS alerts, we're getting a letter we want. So I'm going to stand out there and receive said letter. So she goes and she stands out there. The mail carrier comes along and she asks her for the mail. And she goes, I don't even have it. We're only doing packages. That has been the story for like the last 2 weeks from these people. Okay? Now, I know that doesn't affect everybody, and I know for some of you, you're like, can you get on with the show? You're just complaining right now. But it bothers me, and I have the microphone, and I wanted to talk about it for a second. But anyways, let's dig into it. So an unconstitutional tax cut. What are we talking about here? Well, we see this article from the Lantern where Senator Chris McDaniel is warning other members against what he calls stunts when it comes to the tax cuts. Stunts is what they're calling it. And what are they referring to? Well, they're referring to Representative Steve Doan, who tried to cut our income tax from the 3.5% they're planning on. Right now we're at 4%. They were already passing a bill to cut it down to 3.5%. And he said, you know what? Our goal is to get to zero anyways. Let's go ahead. Let's just cut it to 3%. Let's cut a whole percentage point, essentially cut our income tax by 25% in one go. If 0.5% is good, 1% would be double better, right? So he files an amendment to make that happen. And they ruled that his amendment was unconstitutional. But they showed their hand in the process. And now they're concerned that somebody in the Senate might learn from that amendment and say, you know what? We can file an amendment to cut it down and maybe fix what they're concerned about, which would be a interesting argument and an interesting conversation that the Republican leadership would have to have. Because to set this up for you, the Kentucky Constitution has what's called a balanced budget amendment that was passed. And what that requires is that the state cannot spend more money than it brings in taxes for standard state functions. Now, there's a ways around this. You may say, well, Andrew, but Kentucky has like tons of debt. How does Kentucky have debt while at the same time there's this balanced budget amendment? Well, that is the normal operations of the state. They're able to look at things like perhaps pension obligations and some capital projects that they can sell bonds for, and take individual funds like the road fund, for an example, and they're able to, through some different functions, go into debt through that way. So it's kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul, but, you know, paying Paul is constitutionally mandated, but robbing Peter has no problem with it. That's kind of what they do in order to still go into debt and make the budget work. However, this cut, going from 4% down to 3%, would require them to actually cut current spending levels. And they were not going to do that. They're not prepared to do that. Therefore, they ruled that cutting that a full percentage point would be unconstitutional because that would leave them spending more money than they're bringing in. Now, the real reason why they couldn't let this move forward, they were looking for any reason, because you can make an argument to say, okay, well, if it doesn't take effect for, let's say, 6 months, that gives the legislature time to keep it constitutional because they could just go ahead and pass a spending cut, right? And it would be fine. But what they're saying is they're not prepared to pass that spending cut either. And that goes to the real heart of the problem that we see with our Republican establishment in Kentucky. They are not prepared to stop spending money at all. In fact, that is why recently we saw over this past offseason, the Speaker of the House, David Osborne, come out and say that he thinks maybe possibly we'll never get to 0% income tax. Now, you may remember 2-3 years ago, they came out saying, no, our goal, we're going to get to 0% income tax. We're going to make it. They passed this framework of a bill of a way to cut down slowly. They increased our taxes in other places. They increased the categories that they did sales tax on in order to pay for these tax cuts. And they said, over time, we're going to get down to zero. Well, that's changed because they're not seeing a feasible way to get to zero without having to cut spending. Now, you would hope that, well, if Republicans are claiming that they can't cut spending, well, then they must be just extremely lean, running a very lean, cut-to-the-bone government. But you would be mistaken. In fact, the Republicans, since they took over control of the House in 2017, the legislative year 2017, Republicans in the House have actually spent 41.8% more when adjusted for inflation. The government has spent 41.8% more than it was spending when Republicans took over the House. When they were no longer fighting with the Democrats, their spending has only increased. So I would argue that there's plenty of places to cut spending. In fact, people listen to the show at length and have listened to it over the past several years have heard me many a times have entire episodes dedicated to where we can cut millions upon billions of dollars. When you add it all up, it adds together. Now, you'll hear defenses against that saying, well, you're talking about $1 million here, $1 million there, $10 million there, $20 million there. Like, we got to cut billions. Well, yeah, I hear you got to cut billions, but the tens of millions does add up to billions. And you keep adding more and more and more and more to it. That's the only way we get to a point where we've increased spending 41.8%. So they say, no, you can't pass this tax cut. It's not allowed to come to the floor because we're not going to cut spending, and this requires us to cut spending. Therefore, we're not even going to let it come to the floor for a vote. Because if it had come to a floor for a vote, if instead you said, no, the House should get to decide if they're going to go ahead and vote on this tax increase, knowing that then they're going to have to vote to cut taxes or to cut spending. That should be a decision that the entire body gets to make. Why is it that leadership is coming in to do it? Well, I've told you guys many times on the show that, how that, ecosystem works, that, the leadership spends this money handing out special handouts to special industries and carving out regulations for special industries. In return, those industries donate tons and tons of money into their leadership fund, into the House Republican Caucus Campaign Committee that's controlled by leadership, that then they use. They go ahead and as the carrot and stick to get the legislators to come in line and vote how they want them to. So it's a cycle of power. But at the same time, they don't want to cut spending because, well, that would cut their power. You see, that deals with the real reason why Republicans, once they get into office, have such a hard time following through. All of them campaign on smaller government, spend less money, et cetera, et cetera. But when rubber meets the road, when they actually have to spend less money and government actually has to do less, magically, well, they just can't let it happen. And so they rule this unconstitutional because if it comes to the floor for a vote, it would be political suicide for those Republicans to not vote yes on it. The groups that have been taking out establishment players over the past several years, we're talking about people like Sal Santoro, talking about people like Ed Massey, we're talking about people like Adam Koenig, Richard Heath. They're coming close to taking out Kim Mosier. They came real close 2 years ago. Killian Timoney was taken out by these groups. These groups that have been taking out these not very good, pretty liberal Republicans, you're giving them ammunition that they will use to constantly cudgel every person over the head, and they know that. They can't allow a tax cut to come to the floor that then they're going to have to try to convince their members to vote against. Also, as long as they can pretend that they're trying to cut taxes, we're just doing it responsible. As long as an option isn't put before the rest of the body saying, hey, you can go ahead and cut taxes this much if you vote yes, well, they can maintain this facade, this fakeness that they really are fiscally conservative. They want to be true fiscally conservative Republicans. But the moment then they start coming to members telling them to not vote for a tax cut, that facade's gone. They're no longer telling people that they're a conservative. It's hard to pretend you're a conservative Republican when you've literally fought against across-the-board tax cut. That's the same exact kind of tax cut, by the way, that you're currently advocating for. You just don't like how much it's cutting. But that was in the House. Now a bill, if you know how our process goes, it leaves the House and now it comes over to the Senate. And they are concerned. In fact, Chris McDaniel told the Kentucky Lantern that he was warning other Republican members against similar stunts, putting in place a tax cut as a stunt. Because what they don't want to see now, because they've told you why your amendment was unconstitutional, because it was a tax cut without cutting spending. Well, if a state senator fixes that, if they file an amendment that both cuts the taxes and cuts spending all in one, they now would have to come up with a new reason that they can't allow that to come to the floor. Some sort of germane argument. They'd say, well, that's not germane to the bill for somehow, some way. Which, that would be a problem. And if it becomes blatantly obvious that you are trying to actually continue your high government spending ways to everyone, you can no longer pretend. You might get a few more members waking up to the fact that really their leadership is nothing but a bunch of big government spenders. And if they do, if we get a few more members waking up to it, because we're seeing a growing cadre, we might actually end up seeing a change in leadership, which will be fascinating to see how it plays out. Speaking of Republicans that are doing some big government things, we have two bills coming out of Banta, coming from the kind of northern Kentucky area, that I think bars some discussion, leads to some discussion. First is House Bill 53, which deals with the unlawful release of balloons. That's right. We have solved the problems of the state so much so that we've dealt with all the major illegal things that are actually damaging people, things like squatters' rights, property rights, protecting people's constitutional rights, that now we're moving into the fringes, apparently, that involves dealing with the unlawful release of balloons. I'm going to read the bill. It's not very long, but I want to read to it entirety. A new section of KRS Chapter 512 is created to read as follows. A person is guilty of unlawfully release of balloons when within a 24-hour period he or she intentionally releases, organizes the release of, or causes to be released 10 or more balloons inflated with a gas that is lighter than air, except for balloons released on behalf of a governmental agency or pursuant to a governmental contract for scientific meteorological purposes, hot air balloons that are recovered for launching, balloons released indoors. Unlawful release of balloons is a Class A misdemeanor. Class A misdemeanor. Now, for those of you unaware of what a Class A misdemeanor is, let me give you some examples of what Class A misdemeanors are according to KentuckyCriminalDefense.com. Class A misdemeanors, they are punishable by up to 12 months in jail and up to $500 in fines. A wide range of crimes are categorized as Class A misdemeanors, including but not limited to cultivation of less than 5 marijuana plants, theft by unlawful taking under $500, shoplifting, and a few other kind of theft-type crimes like that. So according to Banta, she thinks that when we're looking at the level of crimes, that if 10 balloons are somehow you cause 10 like party balloons, normal helium balloons to be released in a 24-hour period, and you're not the government, of course, because the government is allowed to do it, you've committed a crime as egregious as an individual stealing $500 from a store. You've committed a crime as egregious as growing marijuana plants unlicensed, which, like I said, depending on who you are, you could view that as shouldn't be illegal or legal or not. But regardless, I think that every one of us should agree that balloons escaping your hand is not equal to shoplifting $500. But Banta believes it is. So I guess we're going to lead to a lot of 10-year-olds in jail. You better not just be handing balloons willy-nilly to kids. Because here's the question, right? So I'm going to read this bill to you again. A person is guilty of unlawful release of balloons when, within a 24-hour period, he or she intentionally releases, organizes the release of, or causes to be released 10 or more balloons inflated with a gas that is lighter than air. So that leads to a little bit of a question here. If I'm at a fair and I'm giving away balloons to kids and they're letting them go, am I now guilty of a Class A misdemeanor because the children have let go of the balloons? Because have I facilitated the release of balloons? Organized the release of or causes to be released? Could you argue in court that I would say State Farm, your local insurance agent, is down there at the county fair handing out State Farm balloons to kids willy-nilly? Could you receive a year in prison because you didn't tie those balloons onto kids' hands? That doesn't seem to be clear in this law. You could argue that I'm causing to be released. I could make an argument that you knew handing that balloon to a small child, it was going to be released. Or if you as an adult, you're walking around and you have 5 kids in your family. There's families that big easily, 6 kids, easily families that big. You give each of your kids a balloon. 4 of them let go of them, go back and grab them, and then throughout the day, somehow the rest of them all lose their balloons. Are you now guilty of a crime worthy of going to jail for a year? This is what happens when we have these legislators just making law. What they saw is they saw somewhere balloons in water somewhere or something, and they saw it. Instead of being a normal citizen and saying, hey, you know what? We should advocate for people to be more respectful of this. We should organize cleanups around this, find a community way to have it, get people involved, alert individuals to this problem, so that way people take personal accountability without government force. That's what a normal person would do. That's what you would do if you discovered some shreds of balloons in your trees or something due to the county fair going on, down the road and kids releasing balloons. That's a normal human response. However, the minute these legislators get elected, suddenly they decide that every single minor problem in their life has to be solved with a new bill, even when it's not government creating that problem. So I'll give you an example. I was registering a car in Kentucky that I was planning on just junking because we'd purchased it for real cheap. Turned out it wasn't that great, and so we were just going to junk it. And in order to junk a vehicle, you have to have the title to that vehicle. So you have to, in order to get a title on an out-of-state vehicle, you have to go down to the office and have them inspect said vehicle to make sure the VINs and everything match so you can get a title issued, and to make sure, lights and other things are working to make sure it's roadworthy as well. That's kind of in the law. And they can come to you and do it, but you had to get inspected. And that seems real odd to me that I'd need to do that to get a title issued, because I wasn't personally planning on driving this vehicle on the roads. They should be able to issue me a title without making sure it's roadworthy if I'm not planning on taking it on the roads. I didn't want a plate. I didn't bring in insurance. I said, I don't need a plate, so on and so forth. Now, that is a problem that I personally encountered, that if I was a legislator, hey, I could see people buying farm trucks or similar situations as I was, and you're forcing them to jump through these hoops because of government regulations that is an inconvenience and expense in their lives. So it's reasonable to take that small situation that maybe legislators have and say, oh, I've experienced something where government's inefficient, or I've experienced something where government's become the problem, and fix it. That's fine. And I know there's plenty of legislators that file bills because they have personally been impacted by some sort of regulation coming from the government. And I'm not talking bad about that. However, what I am talking bad about is when you see something and you're just like, you know what we need? More laws. You know what? I see a problem. I want government to get more involved. But this isn't just a one-off for Kim Banta, of course. She's also filed another piece of legislation where she's essentially attempting to make the risk of owning a gun far greater than the risk of not owning a gun. Because right now, we have our Second Amendment rights. And if you own a firearm, and a lot of people, myself included, believe that, hey, going out, depending on where you are and everything else, not having a gun on you may be a risk you're not willing to take, because you've seen how violent some places are getting. You never know when something's going to go crazy, especially if you live in the city. You never know what's going to happen to you. Or even if you live out in the country, you never know when something might come up, an animal or something else might come at you, and you want to be prepared. That's a pretty normal standard response. But the risk to not having the gun is relatively minuscule right now. If you're a responsible gun owner, the gun isn't going to suddenly start shooting people. If the gun's at home and you have it on you or unloaded and locked away and kept away from kids and everything else, the risk is generally not very high to you of owning a gun. But people like Kim Banta is trying to change that, so she's filed House Bill 55. What that does is it pushes more liability onto parents for if their children commit crimes using firearms. Now, you can already be held liable for crimes and activities your kids do. So why do we need more laws and more punishments for this? Well, simply put, They want to make it to where it is very difficult to own a gun, period. Because they've realized that with the Second Amendment protections, they can't outlaw the ownership of firearms. However, if they can make it to where owning a firearm becomes so risky to you from a legal standpoint, there's too many things that could go wrong, you'll hopefully no longer own one. And that's what they're doing with this legislation, to push more liabilities onto you for owning a firearm if you have a child. Because essentially, it makes it where you may ask yourself a question of, even if you lock up your guns and you lock them away and you keep them away from children and you keep your safes locked and everything else, if somehow those kids still get a hold of those guns, you could be facing a lot of problems in court. That's the point. Now, most kids, 99.99% of kids, aren't going to do anything, aren't going to try to, per se, break into your gun safe, take guns, and go commit crimes with them. However, they want you to think that, maybe you should just get rid of your guns rather than risk it. But that's what happens when you have these people, the same type of person that wants to make it essentially illegal for you to sell helium balloons in Kentucky at the state fair or something because, they're worried about individual responsibility and they believe government has to fulfill a role it can't, are the same types of people that would file this kind of legislation to try to force you to basically give up your guns out of risks of criminal and civil prosecutions. Government interventionism, because, and that is the real difference. When people talk about liberal versus conservative, Republican versus Democrat, liberty versus not, what are the difference? To me, the difference really comes down to, do you look at government as a way to solve all your problems? When you experience something in your life, are you like, oh, we need government to solve this for us? And so many Republicans, despite their stated small government conservative, quote unquote, mindsets, will not accept the fact that government can't solve all problems. That's what freedom means. That's what liberty means. It means you are free to make decisions. But because you're free to make decisions, bad things happen. It's funny too, because a lot of these same people that believe government should solve all your problems, they self-profess to be Christians, but it's within our Christian faith that we say that, bad things don't happen because of God. Bad things happen because we've been given freedom of choice, freedom of self-determination. We have our own wills. God isn't forcing his will onto us. And that leaves us the ability to choose to do things that God would disagree with, and chooses where we make decisions that lead to bad things happening. Bad things don't happen because of God. Bad things happen because of a lack of God. And in much the same way that freedom means that bad things will happen. And if you try to solve all those bad things, all you're going to do is suck away people's freedoms. Well, that's what we got time for today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Thank you all so much for joining me. Back here tomorrow. Hope you have a great rest of your day.